I'm Hazel, 28, and the moment that rerouted the entire course of my life wasn't some tragic accident or dramatic betrayal in a boardroom. It happened on a dusty roadside in Wyoming, outside a half-empty gas station, when my family thought it would be funny to leave me behind. A so-called prank, they called it. Let's see if she finds her way home, they said, before driving off laughing. I didn't follow. I never did. 16 years would pass before I saw any of them again. By then, the girl they deserted had evolved into someone none of them could manipulate ever again, but before I unravel the layers of how being cast aside became the spark for everything that followed, I want you to drop where you're watching from in the comments and hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story of abandonment. It's the blueprint of how I rose from a cruel joke to a life I built entirely on my own terms. To understand how I ended up stranded by my own blood, you have to first understand the household I grew up in. The Reynolds family wasn't known for warmth. Affection came laced with sarcasm. Support arrived only after humiliation. My parents, Barbara and Richard, subscribed to the belief that hardship created strength, and they mistook emotional abuse for bonding. My older brothers, Brett and Craig, perfected this ideology, turning everyday moments into battlefield tactics. From as far back as I can remember, I was always the family punchline. Whether it was a birthday they forgot just to see me cry, before jumping out with a cake, or making my middle school graduation a spectacle by intentionally showing up halfway through, every memory carried an aftertaste of mockery. My senior prom? They gave my date the wrong address, on purpose. I showed up alone. It was just a laugh, they'd all say later. Can't you handle a little fun, Hazel? My mother preferred quiet sabotage over loud cruelty. That color would look lovely on you if you lost 15 pounds. Smile more, sweetheart. It might distract from your skin. Her words cut sharper than any public prank. My father, meanwhile, never missed a chance to laugh the loudest when Brett or Craig pulled something humiliating. It wasn't just normalized, it was encouraged. Brett, 32 at the time, worked with Dad in their insurance business, clearly being molded as the heir. Craig, a few years younger, managed the branding arm of their firm. I had just completed my graphic design degree from a college in Chicago, hoping to break into the creative agency world. But every time I brought it up, the room would fill with condescending chuckles. You can play with Photoshop for our firm, Mom had said dismissively over my graduation dinner. Let's not pretend that's a career. Despite their jabs, they still kept me tethered, paying for my apartment, but reminding me daily that my independence hung by a thread. You should be more grateful, was their favorite weapon. Financial control was their leash, and they tugged at every chance. The Colorado vacation was supposedly my graduation gift. A celebratory road trip. 1 week in a cabin near Rocky Mountain National Park. They called it a bonding opportunity. I called it a sentence. The tension was palpable before we'd even left the driveway. I was wedged in the back seat between Brett's hiking poles and Craig's duffel bag, counting the miles to freedom. As I struggled to tuck my suitcase into the trunk, Craig smirked. You remembered to pack a brain this time, right? Brett chimed in, hey, remember Florida? No swimsuit. 3 days in jeans on the beach. Everyone roared. I smiled weakly, already exhausted. By noon on day one, the games had begun. Brett swiped my phone while I was dozing, texting, I'm lost, to a coworker as a joke. Craig devoured my packed lunch and blamed the hotel staff. Dad deliberately took a scenic route, then blamed my map reading when we arrived late. Every slight was engineered, calculated, and then cloaked in the same excuse, we're just messing with you. That night in a Nebraska motel, I overheard their plan forming. Through the thin adjoining walls, Mom's voice drifted in. She's too soft. This trip might finally fix that. Dad chuckled. Sink or swim, right? It's time she learned to stop crying and start surviving. The words lodged in my chest like thorns. I pulled the covers over my head and whispered to myself, just 5 more days. Then you're done. The next morning started suspiciously smooth. Everyone was unusually civil. No passive-aggressive digs. No pranks. Just laughter, forced smiles, and fake harmony. I should have known then. That eerie calm always came before the storm. We rolled into Wyoming, sunlight bouncing off endless fields, when Dad announced a stop for gas. Next town, we'll fuel up and grab snacks. The gas station was tiny, rundown, and remote. Just a concrete island with a rusty sign and a dusty convenience store. I offered to grab snacks and use the restroom. Get me a soda, Brett muttered. Beef jerky, Craig added without looking up. Mom waved her hand, busy adjusting her lipstick in the mirror. Inside, the air was cold and stale. The only person behind the counter was a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Miranda. I nodded politely, picked up the snacks, and added a bottle of water for myself. Passing through, she asked as I paid. Heading to Colorado, I replied, smiling. Well, safe travels, she said kindly. I didn't realize those would be the last words I'd hear from anyone for hours. When I stepped back outside, everything felt wrong. The car was gone.At first, I thought maybe they'd moved to a different pump. Or pulled around the corner. I walked the entire property, front, back, side street, alley, twice. I checked my phone. No texts. I dialed Dad. Voicemail. Mom. Voicemail. Brett. Voicemail. Craig finally picked up on the fourth ring. Where are you? I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The sound of laughter exploded on the other end. Oh, about 20 minutes. Down the road, Craig said, as if this were all perfectly normal. Turn around. Now. This isn't funny. It's survival of the fittest, sis, Brett shouted in the background. Let's see if she makes it back. The line went dead.A photo pinged onto my screen seconds later. My family grinning in the SUV, the caption reading, "Find your way home, champ." I stared at the image, heart pounding, mind racing. Called back. Straight to voicemail. Tried again. And again. Then I checked my contact list to blocked. Every single one. I stood frozen under the unforgiving Wyoming sun, the snacks still in my arms, my thoughts unraveling faster than I could contain them. My suitcase? Gone. My spare charger? Gone. My family? Gone. All I had were my clothes, a purse, $43 in cash, a half-drained phone battery, and a sinking realization that they weren't coming back. They hadn't forgotten me. They'd left me, deliberately. The asphalt beneath my sandals burned as I wandered around the gas station again, desperately trying to will their return into existence. My mind cycled through every possible explanation. Maybe Dad had forgotten something. Perhaps they were testing me. But with each passing second, the sinking dread inside me turned into cold, immovable certainty. This wasn't an oversight, it was orchestration. I checked my phone. Battery at 18%. No signal bars. And that photo, my family laughing while I stood in a barren parking lot, stared back at me from the screen. My hands trembled as I opened the group message again. There it was. A second photo, sent minutes later. Showing them at a diner table, piled plates and raised glasses, captioned, "Wonder if Hazel figured out dinner yet." Miranda, the cashier from earlier, spotted me sitting on the curb as she locked up for the evening. Concern etched deep into her face, she approached gently, like one would a wounded animal. "Sweetheart, you've been out here for hours. Do you need help?" My voice cracked. "They left me here." "What do you mean?" she asked, crouching next to me. "My family drove off. As a joke. They think it's character development." Miranda's brows furrowed. "You're serious?" I nodded, tears gathering behind my eyes. "They blocked my number. Won't answer calls. I don't know what to do." She sat beside me without hesitation. "You got someone else you can call? Any friends nearby?" I shook my head. My closest friend had moved to California 2 months ago. Everyone else I'd known back home were more like acquaintances. I had no extended family I could trust. I'd been so isolated for so long that the loneliness didn't even feel unfamiliar, it felt expected. Miranda sighed and rubbed her temples. "There's a lady in town who rents a room. Name's Eleanor. Sweetheart in her 60s. Let me give her a ring." I was too stunned to respond. Everything felt surreal, like my mind had detached from my body and was floating just above the scene, watching as a stranger's life crumbled. When Eleanor arrived, her presence was immediately grounding. She wore a faded cardigan, white curls pinned back neatly, and eyes full of quiet command. "Come on, darling," she said, motioning toward her pickup truck. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Her home was a modest yellow house with wildflowers crowding the walkway. Inside, it smelled like lemon tea and old books. She showed me to a small spare room with a twin bed, a pale blue quilt, and a wooden dresser. There was no lock, but for the first time in hours, I felt safe enough to breathe. "I don't expect rent," Eleanor said. "Not until you're back on your feet. Miranda told me enough. We'll talk more in the morning. For now, here's a robe, a toothbrush, and fresh towels." I showered in silence, the water masking my sobs. That night, in a borrowed nightgown, beneath someone else's blanket, I lay staring at the ceiling. Part of me still believed that my phone would light up with apologies. That I'd hear tires in the driveway and my parents rushing inside, saying they'd gone too far. But morning came with only sunlight and birdsong. Eleanor, already sipping coffee at the kitchen table, handed me a warm mug. "You need to call someone?" she asked gently. I nodded and used her landline to dial every family number I still remembered by heart. No one answered. At 10:15 a.m., I reached the receptionist at Reynolds Insurance Group. I explained who I was. "Asked to speak with Richard Reynolds." "They're in a meeting," she said, chipper and unconcerned. Want to leave a message? I did. Tell him Hazel called. I'm safe. Barely. But I'm done chasing them. Eleanor took me to the library. So I could charge my phone. Once it powered on, the messages waiting for me shattered whatever fragile hope had lingered. Day 2 of Hazel's adventure. Brett had texted, including a photo of them hiking through a Colorado trail. From Craig, hitched a ride yet? Then my father, your lease isn't our problem anymore. Consider this your first real-life bill. Your welcome. My bank app showed $237.42. That wasn't going to get me home, let alone cover a month of rent. I sat on Eleanor's porch, staring at the screen. They're not coming, I whispered. They've really done it. Instead of the pity I feared, Eleanor leaned against the porch post and gave a solemn nod. Then we start from here. I looked at her in disbelief. You're not shocked? Oh. I'm furious, she said calmly. But I've seen what cruel people disguise as tough love. And I've seen what women like you can become when given half a chance. She offered me a job, part-time, at her bookstore, Pages and Poems, just down the road. Enough to cover rent if I took on some cleaning and inventory tasks. $300 a month for the room. You can work it off here until something better comes along. I accepted without hesitation. The bookstore felt like a forgotten place, dusty shelves, an ancient register, and hardly any customers. Eleanor admitted her nephew had built the website 5 years ago and hadn't touched it since. I also need something that pays actual cash, I told her. For food. For a future. So, I went door to door through Pineridge's tiny downtown strip, 3 blocks of diners, antique stores, a post office, and a hardware shop. I handed out copies of a quickly thrown together resume to anyone willing to take one. By sunset, I had a job offer from the Pinewood Diner, early morning shifts, 6 days a week. It paid minimum wage, but came with free meals. That night, I collapsed onto Eleanor's spare bed, body aching, heart torn between grief and determination. I had nothing left of the life I'd built in Chicago. My apartment was already slipping away. The safety net my family had dangled beneath me for years had turned out to be a trapdoor. I wasn't just starting over, I was starting from below zero. Still, that night, as I stared at the ceiling once again, something had shifted. There was no going back, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. My first week in Pineridge blurred into a sleepless haze of motion and heartbreak. Mornings began before sunrise. I tied on an apron, served scrambled eggs and refilled coffee mugs for hours at the Pinewood Diner. I forced politeness through exhaustion, hid tears behind napkin dispensers, and smiled at strangers like I wasn't shattered. Afternoons were quieter, spent helping Eleanor at the bookstore, dusting, rearranging paperbacks, checking inventory, trying to forget the sting of every unread message and every blocked number. Each evening, I stared at my phone, waiting for something, anything, to suggest my family regretted what they'd done. But the texts kept arriving like clockwork, none of them kind. You find a greyhound yet? Craig asked on day 4. This is still hilarious. From Dad, the world's not fair. Better you learn it now. Even my mother, who once tucked me in and kissed my forehead, sent a chilling note. You'll thank us someday. This builds resilience. Their cruelty no longer felt confusing. It felt intentional. My survival was never part of their joke, it was their challenge. By week's end, my coworkers at the diner knew something was off. Amber, a waitress a few years younger than me, caught me crying in the supply closet one afternoon. Her voice was rough, worn from late nights and raising a toddler alone, but gentle when she said, "You don't have to explain, but if you need someone to talk to, I'm not going anywhere." I told her everything. The gas station. The messages. The silence. Amber didn't laugh. She didn't blink. She just leaned back against the mop bucket and said, "They did you a favor." I stared at her like she'd slapped me, not on purpose. She added, "But it's the truth. Anyone who'd do that to you didn't love you the way you deserve. Now you've got a clean slate. You're free." The word free felt foreign. I'd never been free, just tethered. Controlled. Humiliated. Now, the ropes were gone, and I was left holding the knife that had cut them loose. That night, I stopped checking for new messages. Instead, I opened Eleanor's ancient desktop and started updating my resume. I wrote to my college professors, explained the situation in vague terms, and asked for references. I created a new email account, one no one back in Chicago could access. That inbox, I decided, would be the place where my real life would begin. Eleanor noticed the change. "You've been busy," she said as I worked on a flyer for the bookstore's upcoming author visit. "Didn't you study design?" I nodded. Graphic design, digital media. I wanted to work at an agency, until I got left behind. She studied the flyer I'd made, clean fonts, bold colors, crisp layout, and smiled. "You've got a gift." I know a guy who builds websites for local businesses. Name's Mason. He could use someone like you. The next day, Mason walked into the bookstore. Late 30s, scruffy beard, tired eyes behind thick glasses. You Hazel? He asked. Eleanor says you're good with visuals. I handed him my portfolio, college projects I'd uploaded to the cloud before graduation. He flipped through them slowly, then gave a low whistle. You did all this? I nodded, nerves churning. This is solid. I'm good at back-end stuff, databases, e-commerce, but my designs suck. Maybe we collaborate. I'll teach you some coding. You help me make clients happy. I blinked. You'd pay me? Not a fortune, he chuckled. But yeah, freelancers cost more and care less. You're here. You care. That matters. It was the first time in weeks I'd felt truly seen. Within days, we were building our first joint site. I'd handle visuals. He'd do the back end. Eleanor's store became our guinea pig, an updated layout, new features, an event calendar, and a clean checkout system. When she saw the final product, she cried. I haven't had this many online orders in years. In between web projects, I pulled shifts at the diner and shelved books at Pages and Poems. Mason taught me CSS and HTML. Amber introduced me to her friends, a circle of kind, funny women who invited me to potlucks and game nights. Slowly, Wyoming became less of a detour and more of a destination. One night, as we closed up the bookstore, Eleanor turned to me. You ever thought about staying? I hesitated. Staying? Not forever, she said. But long enough to build something. You've already started. I couldn't answer, because staying meant letting go. Not just of Chicago, but of the hope that my family would one day redeem themselves. That hope, however fragile, had been the last thing I clung to. And now, it didn't feel necessary anymore. 2 weeks later, I walked into the post office and rented a P.O. box. On the application form, under permanent address, I wrote Eleanor's. A small gesture, but it felt enormous. By the start of my second month in Pinery Ridge, the chaos had quieted. The texts had stopped. The blockages remained. Silence had replaced mockery, and in that silence, something unexpected bloomed. Peace. The routines I once resented began to feel grounding. I'd wake before the sun rose, pull on my uniform, and walk to the Pinewood Diner, the streetlights humming gently overhead. Locals greeted me by name now, farmers, mechanics, librarians, people who didn't know anything about where I came from, but had come to care about where I was going. Amber became my anchor. Her kindness was steady and matter-of-fact, never wrapped in pity. She brought her toddler to the bookstore on weekends, and he started calling me Hazy. Mason and I began sharing a small desk in the back corner of the shop, where we worked on client websites between coffee refills and pages from mystery novels. Eleanor, too, had begun treating me less like a boarder and more like a niece. I'd never known this kind of belonging. It was simple. Quiet. But it was real. Then came the email from my former landlord in Chicago. Your lease is terminated. Belongings must be claimed within 5 business days or disposed of per policy. I sat motionless, rereading the lines. It was over. Everything I owned, clothes, books, memories, was about to vanish. I typed a reply, donate anything useful. Trash the rest. My fingers shook. But when I hit send, an unexpected feeling followed, liberation. Those items were never really mine. They were given under conditions. Attached to guilt. Tethered to manipulation. Letting them go wasn't just necessary, it was symbolic. I was no longer the girl whose apartment existed because her parents funded it. I was becoming the woman who made her own rules. Mason noticed the shift. You're walking different, he said one afternoon. What does that mean? Like someone who doesn't owe anyone an explanation. I laughed for the first time in days. You ever thought about doing this full time? He asked, tapping the edge of my latest web layout. What, design? He nodded. You've got the talent. The eye. There's no agency for 200 miles. These mom-and-pop places need people like you. It sounded like a dream. And for the first time, it didn't sound impossible. I took on my first freelance client that week, a bakery 2 towns over in need of a new logo and flyers. The pay wasn't much, but it covered groceries and bought me a used laptop from a pawn shop. My second client came through Amber's friend, who owned a yoga studio and wanted business cards and a refreshed website. Then a local B&B. Then a dog groomer. My days filled quickly, diner shifts in the morning, design work in the afternoon, bookstore projects in the evening. I was exhausted. But I wasn't empty. With 3 steady clients, I saved enough to move out of Eleanor's house and into a tiny studio apartment above the hardware store. 400 square feet. Slanted ceilings. Creaky pipes. But it was mine. I carried in 1 suitcase and 1 houseplant. I set the succulent on the window ledge and whispered, we start fresh here. That night, I cooked scrambled eggs on a single burner stove and danced barefoot to a playlist I hadn't listened to since college. Then my phone rang, unknown number. I froze, curiosity outweighed caution. I picked up. Hazel? The voice was unmistakable. Brett. I didn't speak. It's been 3 months. Look, we were just messing around. We didn't think you'd actually stay gone. Are you okay? Why do you care? I said, voice calm. Because the joke's over. Come home. Everyone misses you. Mom's freaking out. My silence lingered. You're not still mad, are you? He added, sounding incredulous. Mad? I laughed bitterly. You left me in another state. With no suitcase. No ride. No safety net. And now that I'm not crawling back, now it's serious. We assumed you'd figure it out. I did figure it out. That I'm better off without any of you. He scoffed. Come on. What are you doing for money? I run a design studio, I replied. I have clients. A home. A life. There was a pause. You're being ridiculous. No, Brett. I'm being free. Then I hung up, and blocked him again. For the next week, new numbers tried calling. One left a voicemail. It was my father. This has gone too far. Call when you're ready to stop being dramatic. I deleted it without listening to the end. Amber and Mason threw me a small celebration the night I officially registered a business name, New Horizon Design Studio. We toasted with root beer floats and homemade cupcakes. I had never felt prouder. In just 3 months, I had gone from abandoned to independent. Not because I wanted to prove anything to them, but because I finally realized I didn't have to earn anyone's approval to exist. They'd left me in Wyoming expecting me to break. Instead, I bloomed. 6 months had passed since the day I was left alone in Wyoming, half a year since I stood outside that gas station, abandoned without warning, while the people I once called family disappeared behind a cloud of dust and laughter. Back then, I had no job. No plan. No belief in myself. Now, I was the founder of a growing creative agency, designing websites and brand materials for businesses scattered across the Mountain West. My mornings still started at the diner, but fewer hours each week. The rest of my time was split between Eleanor's bookstore, freelance projects, and late-night coding sessions beside Mason. The town that had once felt like exile had quietly transformed into sanctuary. Eleanor's bookstore had become a hub again. After launching her new site, we hosted weekly readings and book clubs. Foot traffic increased. So did sales. Locals started referring to me not as the girl who works for Eleanor, but the designer who fixed the shop. People came to me for help, flyers, logos, digital menus, online storefronts. Each job added credibility. Each happy client became a walking advertisement. By autumn, I had 12 regular clients, and Mason and I began splitting revenue on joint contracts. You need a bigger workspace, he said one night, reviewing a wireframe on his laptop. This setup's not going to last. He was right. I'd been designing from the corner of my tiny apartment, laptop balanced on a wobbly card table. My printer sat on the floor. My samples were stuffed into crates beneath my bed. I'd been thinking about moving the business downtown. I said, half ashamed of the ambition creeping into my voice. Mason didn't flinch. Do it. I'll help with the lease. The following week, we signed papers on a modest office above an old bakery, 2 rooms, large windows, exposed brick, and just enough space for growth. We painted the walls ourselves. Eleanor brought over a potted fern. Amber gifted a vintage typewriter she found at a thrift store. When we hung the New Horizon Design Studio sign outside, I stood in the middle of the office and felt something I hadn't felt in years, rooted, not indebted. Not tolerated, rooted, and yet, just as I began to settle into this new rhythm, the past found a way to crawl back. It began with a letter, no return address. Handwritten in script I hadn't seen in over a decade. My mother's. Inside was a brief note and a photograph. A family portrait, taken at a holiday gathering I hadn't been invited to. My brothers stood side by side, their wives smiling politely. My father sat in a chair, visibly thinner, paler. My mother, perfectly posed beside him, wrote just 5 words below the image, "We've changed. Please come home." I burned it in the fireplace. Then came the email from Brett, sent from a work address I hadn't blocked. Subject, talk? Body, I saw your article. You've done well. But you still owe us a conversation. I stared at the screen for nearly an hour. Oh them, I remembered being 19, crying in the bathroom after mom told me no one would love me unless I lost weight. I remembered being 23, presenting my senior portfolio to a room full of strangers because my parents couldn't be bothered to attend the exhibition. I remembered being 28, standing on hot pavement in Wyoming while they mocked me over speakerphone and drove away. If anyone owed anything, it wasn't me. I archived the message and moved on, but the universe, as it often does, had one more test in store. I was in Denver, waiting at a coffee shop for a prospective client, reviewing design mock-ups and sipping chai, when a voice pulled me out of focus. Hazel. I looked up, pulse stuttering, and Brett, standing there in a tailored suit, briefcase in hand, hair slicked back like it had been when he was still the family golden boy. For a moment, I said nothing. Neither did he then. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat without asking. I can't believe it's really you, he said, trying to smile. You look different. I am different. He gestured to the tablet, the business cards fanned on the table. You're running a company? I nodded. Impressive, he murmured. We've been looking for you, you know. No, Brett. I replied, pushing the cards into my bag. You've been ignoring me for years. Now that I'm visible, suddenly I matter. He winced. It got out of hand. The prank, none of us thought you'd actually vanish. We figured you'd call. Come back. You didn't. No, I didn't. I'm here because Dad's retiring, he said, voice softening. He wants to reconnect. We all do. I stared at him. He laughed while you drove off. That's the last thing I remember. Laughter. His smile faded. I built this life, I continued, rising from my chair. Every piece of it. Without your help. Without your encouragement. Without your approval. And I'm not giving any of it up for another round of family therapy that starts with gaslighting and ends with silence. Brett stood too. Please, just think about it. I have, I replied. That's why I'm walking away. I left him standing there, speechless. By the time I returned to Pineridge that evening, my decision was firm. I wasn't going backward, not for apologies wrapped in guilt, not for half-hearted reconciliations drenched in self-interest. I hadn't just built a career. I'd reclaimed my identity, and I wasn't surrendering either. When I got back to Pineridge that night, the mountains felt taller, the stars clearer. Distance had gifted me vision. I had walked into Denver as a woman still questioning her boundaries, and walked out knowing exactly where they stood. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just deleted Brett's follow-up message. This isn't over. He was right. But not for the reason he thought. The next morning, I met Mason and Amber at the office, and we dove into a branding project for a new outdoor gear shop in Utah. Between logo sketches and color palettes, I told them what had happened in Denver. Mason leaned back in his chair. So now they know where you are? I nodded. Amber's expression darkened. You think they'll show up? If they do, I said calmly, they'll find someone they don't recognize. That evening, I visited Eleanor. She was folding laundry in the living room, her cat curled beside her on the sofa. I told her everything, Brett's ambush. The letter, the subtle pressure building around me like a storm cloud. They don't want reconciliation, I said. They want relief from the discomfort of what they did. Eleanor didn't speak right away. She finished folding a shirt, placed it neatly on the pile, then looked up. You've come too far to let them rewrite your ending, she said. I nodded slowly. They think I'm still that girl in the parking lot. Crying. Powerless. You're not, she said. You never were. You just needed to see it. The following week, I gathered my circle, Amber, Mason, Eleanor, a few others who had become fixtures in my life, and told them the full story. Not just the gas station. The years of belittlement, the manipulation masked as parenting, the endless emotional erosion. I've kept quiet for so long, I said. But if they try to reach any of you, I want you to know why I cut them off. Amber took my hand. Hazel, they don't get to claim you anymore. Not after what they did. Mason nodded. They're ghosts. You're living. I returned to my apartment that night and opened my laptop. I drafted an email. Not to reconnect. Not to mend. To close. Subject, boundaries. To my former family, I am not interested in reunions, explanations, or performances of regret. I am thriving without you. Any further attempts to contact me, directly, or through others, will be treated as harassment. This is not cruelty. It's closure. Do not respond. Hazel. I sent it. Then blocked every address again. No shaking hands. No tears. Just peace. 2 days later, we launched a campaign for a regional coffee brand. The client loved it. Our inbox flooded with inquiries. I hired my first assistant. New Horizon Design was no longer a scrappy experiment, it was a studio with momentum. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was finalizing a presentation, my receptionist buzzed me. You have a visitor. I frowned. A client? Not exactly. I stepped into the lobby. Barbara Reynolds stood near the window, her heels perfectly polished, her blazer unwrinkled, her smile cautious. Hello, Hazel, she said, as though nothing had happened. I didn't blink. You're not supposed to be here. The article gave your address, she said. I needed to see you. I didn't respond. Just studied her. Gone was the icy confidence. Her eyes flickered with unease. I'm not here to justify anything, she said. Only to ask. Ask what? For 5 minutes. Not as your mother. As someone who knows they were wrong. I paused, then motioned toward my office. She followed, stepping into the space where I'd rebuilt everything she'd once tried to break. Photos of my team lined the walls. Our biggest projects framed in minimalist wood. Bookshelves full of color palettes, mock-ups, mood boards. A real business. A real life. She looked around slowly. This is beautiful. I built it without your help. I know, she said, voice soft. That's why I'm here. I didn't sit. Neither did she. My father was cold, she began. Your grandfather. He made me feel small. I passed that forward. I thought that's what strength looked like: perfection, power, control. I didn't know I was raising my daughter to survive me. That's not an apology, I said quietly. That's an excuse. She nodded. I know. I just needed to say it out loud. Even if you never want to see me again. There was silence between us, the kind that stretches decades wide. I didn't offer forgiveness. But I also didn't scream. I didn't throw her out. That, I realized, was growth. I don't hate you, I said. But I don't need you. She swallowed hard. Then I'll go. As she turned, I added, tell the others not to follow. She hesitated. They won't. Outside, the sky had begun to darken. I stood at my office window and watched her walk away, and in that moment, I felt it. Not relief, not victory, but clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming everything they thought I'd lose. Barbara's unannounced appearance at my office didn't shatter me, nor did it soothe anything. It was a ripple, not a wave. I watched her disappear down the sidewalk from my window, the woman who raised me walking out of my life a second time, but this time without control. She hadn't left victorious. She had departed empty-handed. And, while she hoped for a thaw in the ice, all she found was solid ground under my feet, ground she no longer had the power to shake. The conversation didn't offer comfort or healing, but it gave me something else: finality. She had acknowledged, without argument, that I had thrived without them, and in doing so, had removed the last shred of justification they clung to for abandoning me in Wyoming. The following week passed in a flurry of momentum. I completed 2 major projects, signed 3 new clients, and received a proposal from a regional bank to redesign their mobile interface. Each contract I accepted, each invoice I issued, each glowing testimonial that came in was another stone laid on the foundation they once tried to bury me beneath. My agency was no longer just a small-town success story. It was becoming a name with weight, recognized across 3 states as a rising creative force. Our story was even picked up in a small business podcast, and suddenly inquiries tripled. That's when I decided to expand. I hired a second designer, a marketing assistant, and brought Mason on full-time as lead developer. The studio moved into a larger space above the courthouse, more light, more room, and more symbolism. The building once represented structure and judgment, but now it was where I led a team built from resilience, talent, and the determination to never again be cornered. On the day we held our ribbon cutting for the new studio, the mayor stopped by to shake my hand. Amber brought cookies. Eleanor cried. Mason raised a coffee cup in my honor. It felt surreal. I stood on the second-floor balcony after everyone left, overlooking the quiet streets of Pine Ridge as the sun dipped behind the hills, and realized I hadn't thought about Chicago in days. That was the moment it hit me: my silence hadn't been petty. It was necessary. It was power reclaimed. And yet, 2 weeks after Barbara's visit, another envelope arrived, this time official-looking, with legal letterhead. At first, I thought it might be a tax document or licensing notice. But when I opened it, my heart paused mid-beat. The letter was from a law firm representing Reynolds Insurance Group. It announced the completed sale of the company, and outlined that the proceeds were to be split evenly among all 3 Reynolds children, including me. I read it twice, then a third time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The breakdown revealed a staggering sum, enough to buy a home outright, pay for a second location, or invest in future ventures. Along with the document was a sealed envelope. Handwritten across the front, in familiar cursive, was one word: Hazel. Inside was a personal note from my mother. No apologies. No groveling. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the inheritance was intentional. She claimed it was my father's way of admitting his failure, even if pride kept him from saying it aloud. The letter included details for a gathering, a final family dinner before their move to Arizona. My brothers would be there. So would their families. I was invited. No pressure, she wrote. No expectations. Just a closing chapter before a new one began. I stared at the invitation for hours that night, holding it like a fragile bomb. Part of me wanted to toss it into the trash and be done. Another part whispered that closure sometimes required confrontation. I spoke to Sam, my partner, my anchor. We'd met at the bookstore, after he'd wandered in looking for a biography and left with my number. We'd been together for nearly 3 years now, living in a renovated bungalow just outside town with a shared garden and quiet routines that felt like peace. He listened as I read the letter aloud, then asked, simply, "Do you want to go?" I didn't know. I wanted to know if the people who caused so much damage had changed. I wanted to see if time had transformed them or merely softened their edges for performance. But I also feared reopening scars that had only recently healed. The days that followed, I caught myself imagining the encounter. Not the fairy tale version, but the real one, the awkward silences, the tension, the half-hearted hugs. I imagined Brett trying to charm his way through small talk, Craig making jokes to distract, and my father offering stiff nods instead of apologies. I imagined sitting across the table from them and realizing they still didn't see me. And yet, there was a curiosity I couldn't extinguish. What if I didn't go for them, but for myself? What if showing up wasn't a submission, but a declaration that the person they left behind was now someone they couldn't diminish? So, I booked a flight. One night. A hotel nearby. No overnight stays in the family home. No entanglements. Just one appearance. My terms. My timing. I told no one except Sam and Mason. I arrived in Chicago on a gray Saturday afternoon. The air felt heavier there, the skyline more distant, the traffic less forgiving. As I stepped into the Uber and gave the driver the address of my childhood home, I felt like I was walking into a memory rather than a reunion. The house looked unchanged, same ivy creeping across the bricks, same porch swing creaking in the breeze. My mother answered the door with a smile too polished, too rehearsed. "Hazel," she said, as though we'd spoken yesterday. I nodded, expression unreadable, and followed her inside. The living room was filled with carefully placed appetizers and tension. Brett stood by the fireplace, wine glass in hand, pretending he hadn't scanned me head to toe the moment I entered. Craig sat beside his new wife, who offered a polite smile and nothing else. My father remained seated, older now, frail, and markedly quieter. He didn't stand. He just stared at me with a look I couldn't decipher, part regret, part pride, mostly discomfort. Dinner was served with forced civility. Polite questions. Short answers. No one mentioned Wyoming. No one acknowledged what had happened. But the silence said enough. And after the plates were cleared and the table wiped clean, my father asked to speak privately. We stepped into his study, a room I wasn't allowed in as a child, a place once filled with reprimands and lectures. Now, it was filled with hesitance. He motioned for me to sit. I did. He didn't. "I was wrong," he said simply, without theatrics. "All of it. The way we treated you. The things we believed. I thought I was teaching strength. I see now I was teaching pain. I didn't cry. I didn't forgive. But I nodded, because acknowledgement, even when late, still carries weight. When I left that night, my mother tried to hug me. I offered a polite, one-armed embrace. I wasn't ready for more. And that was okay. As the plane lifted into the night sky, I looked down at the city that raised me, broke me, and finally let me go. I didn't know if I'd ever return. I didn't know if they would ever truly change. But I knew who I was. I had faced them, and not once had I felt small. Not once did I shrink. The girl they abandoned at the edge of a Wyoming road was gone. In her place stood a woman who had built a future so radiant that even their shadows couldn't reach her. Returning to Wyoming felt like stepping back into warmth after holding your breath underwater. As my flight descended over the sprawling ridgelines and golden hills of Pine Ridge, I wasn't the same woman who had boarded that plane 2 days prior. I hadn't gone looking for redemption in Chicago, nor had I expected forgiveness, and certainly not love. But what I found in that cold, heavy city was proof of my evolution. I had faced every ghost, looked each unspoken wound in the eye, and walked out unscarred. I wasn't angry anymore, not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd grown past the reach of their damage. Sam met me at the airport, his arms open, his smile soft with understanding. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't need to. The look in my eyes said enough. That evening, back in our home, a craftsman-style house with soft lighting, crooked bookshelves, and a little garden struggling against the frost, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders and breathed in the familiar air. The crickets chirped. Wind rustled the old pine behind our shed. Inside, water boiled on the stove, and soft music floated from the kitchen. This wasn't just a new chapter. It was the entire second volume of my life, rewritten in a voice I'd finally reclaimed as my own. 2 months passed quickly. Business soared. New Horizon Design expanded into a second location in Montana, where a rising number of small business owners had reached out after seeing our work. We weren't just designing websites, we were helping rebuild legacies, rebrand generational shops, revitalize dying family businesses. Every client came with a story, and my team had grown into not just employees, but storytellers, digital architects, brand builders who believed in mission over margin. Eleanor retired from the bookstore that spring, passing the keys to a young couple who'd moved to town recently and fallen in love with its creaky floors and poetry readings. She said she'd stay on as an advisor, but I could tell she was ready for quiet walks, uninterrupted mornings, and more time in her garden. I bought her a leather-bound journal, the cover engraved with her name in gold, and wrote a note on the inside cover: "You didn't just give me shelter. You gave me back my future." She cried when she read it, then hugged me tighter than my own mother ever had. Mason and I continued to partner on everything, building the agency brick by brick, though in our case, it was code by code, pixel by pixel. His laughter came more often these days, lighter than when we'd first met. He credited me for that. I credited Wyoming. Amber's son, now in 2nd grade, had declared he wanted to be a designer like Auntie Hazy when he grew up, and I promised him that when he was ready, I'd teach him everything I knew. Sam and I began discussing long-term plans, opening a satellite office in Colorado, maybe buying the adjacent lot to extend our garden, perhaps fostering children someday. Our life was calm, built on compassion and mutual respect, unrecognizable from the life I had known growing up. And then, on a Wednesday in June, a new envelope arrived, not from a law office or a familiar handwriting, but from a glossy publication I vaguely remembered being interviewed by. Business West magazine had published their Women in Design feature, and I was one of the cover profiles. The spread included a full-page photo of our office, our team mid-meeting, and me standing at the whiteboard, mid-laugh, midlife. The article spoke of growth, grit, creativity, and leadership rooted in community. I shared it online. The post went viral. Comments poured in from other women, some in similar fields, others in completely different walks of life, who resonated with the story of rebuilding after emotional injury. One comment stood out, though it was buried beneath hundreds. It was from someone anonymous, using a blank avatar. All it said was, "We never thought you'd become someone so unstoppable." There was no name, no follow-up. But I didn't need one. I knew. That night, I received a string of messages in my emails, other folder, emails from addresses I hadn't blocked because I didn't recognize them. My mother. My father. Brett. Craig. All of them, in separate words, reaching out once more. Subject lines like, "Please talk to us," and "We read the article," filled the space between sincerity and manipulation. One email from Brett simply said, "You win." Another, from my father, said, "You deserve everything you've earned." And one from my mother, longer, apologetic, awkward, and clearly written more than once before being sent, ended with, "We hope there's still room for us in the world you've built, but here's the thing, they were no longer part of the equation." I read those emails. I felt their intent. But I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish them. Not because I needed them to suffer. But because I finally realized they couldn't walk back into a life they'd never helped construct. Their absence had been my crucible. Their abandonment had sparked the forge. And now that the metal had cooled, now that the shape had hardened, there was no place for hands that had once tried to melt me down. I told Sam what had happened, and he simply said, "You don't owe anyone anything." That night, I added a new print to the office wall. It was a quote from Eleanor, something she'd once told me when I questioned whether I deserved the peace I'd finally found. "You didn't just survive. You created something stronger than what broke you." The summer that followed the magazine article was golden, both in sunlight and circumstance. Everything bloomed: my garden, my business, my peace. New Horizon Design received a grant for innovation in rural entrepreneurship. I was invited to speak at a creative leadership summit in Salt Lake City. Clients from as far as Idaho began scheduling consultations, and I hired a project manager to help handle the volume. My mornings started with sunrise walks beside Sam. The gravel trail crunching beneath our shoes as we discussed campaign strategies, recipes, and dreams that no longer felt far-fetched. We talked about expanding, not just professionally, but personally, opening our home to foster care, mentoring teens interested in design and coding, creating scholarships for local students who, like I once did, needed someone to believe in their potential before they'd ever learned how to believe in themselves. It was during one of those early walks that I paused to reflect on something I hadn't said aloud in years. "Do you think they ever imagined this for me?" I asked, eyes scanning the horizon. Sam didn't answer immediately. He picked a small sprig of mint from a passing bush and handed it to me. "I don't think they imagined you'd ever stop needing them," he replied. The truth in his words was undeniable. My absence hadn't been silence, it had been proof. Every year I spent thriving without their influence, every decision I made without their input, was a louder statement than anything I could have shouted in anger. I'd erased the version of me they crafted and replaced her with someone who didn't owe anyone explanations. As autumn rolled in, I celebrated the 3rd anniversary of New Horizon with an open house at our main studio. clients, community members, and colleagues filled the building with laughter and congratulations. Mason gave a short toast that ended with, "To the woman who turned exile into empire." Amber brought homemade pie. Eleanor, radiant as ever, sat near the window beaming like a proud aunt. And somewhere in the back corner, I saw Miranda, the gas station attendant who'd first shown me kindness after abandonment. I hadn't seen her in years. We embraced like family. "You made it," she whispered. "You made it." That night, after everyone left, I stood alone in the conference room surrounded by framed milestones, fresh flowers, and a glass plaque that read, "Innovation Champion of the Year." I stared at my reflection in the window, not for vanity, but to study the woman staring back, the one who used to be so afraid of falling apart that she forgot how to rise. Weeks later, while preparing design layouts for a new health clinic opening in a nearby town, I received another letter. This time it wasn't typed or formal. It was handwritten and simple. Inside was a photo of a house, my childhood home. The note read, "We're selling the property. Would you like to keep anything?" There was no signature, but I recognized my mother's handwriting. I folded the paper once and set it aside without reaction. Later, as I sipped tea on the porch with Sam, I told him. He raised an eyebrow. "Do you want anything from it?" I shook my head. The only thing I ever wanted from that house was freedom. I already have that. And I did. Freedom wasn't just about geography. It was about space, mental, emotional, spiritual. And I had carved mine out with my own hands. My parents selling the house wasn't loss. It was punctuation. A closing period on a story I no longer had to rewrite or relive. And yet, in a strange way, I felt something akin to gratitude. Not for their treatment. Not for their choices. But for the clarity they'd given me. They had forced me to rebuild. And I had done it without shortcuts, without pity, and without permission. The month after the house was listed, I received an invitation to speak at a university design program in Denver. As I walked through the campus, past students carrying sketchbooks and laptops, I remembered being their age, hungry for approval. Desperate to prove my worth, unsure if I had any. I spoke about visual storytelling, about authenticity in branding, but most importantly, I spoke about resilience. I told them that your work doesn't need to be perfect to be powerful. That your worth doesn't decrease when someone fails to recognize it. That sometimes the most important project you'll ever undertake is rebuilding yourself from what others tried to destroy. Afterward, students lined up to speak with me, many with tears in their eyes, not because of design advice, but because someone had finally told them they didn't have to beg for love in places that only offered conditional acceptance. That night, back in my hotel, I received one more message from a familiar, now muted number. "Saw your talk. You've become someone I wouldn't recognize. I hope one day we can meet again." Brett. I didn't delete it. I didn't reply either. I simply turned off the phone, turned toward the window, and whispered to the moonlit skyline, "That version of me is gone." The fourth winter after my family vanished from that Wyoming gas station arrived like a soft exhale. Snow blanketed the hills behind our house, frosting every branch in delicate lace. Inside, our home pulsed with warmth, crackling wood in the fireplace, tea kettles whistling, sketches scattered across the dining table, and a business calendar already booked 2 months into the new year. Sam and I had settled into our shared rhythm, a partnership built not on obligation but mutual reverence. He never asked me to explain my silences. He never tried to fix what he didn't break. He simply stood beside me, unwavering, offering quiet strength when I needed to rest and stepping back when I needed to run. That winter, we began paperwork to become foster parents. Not because we had something to prove, but because we understood what it meant to be unseen, overlooked, and undervalued. We wanted to be the hands that caught others when the world decided they didn't matter. Around the same time, New Horizon Design reached its next milestone, our 5th expansion, this time into Oregon. We were no longer a regional agency. We were a growing network of creatives offering design, branding, and digital infrastructure to rural businesses often ignored by larger firms. We became known not just for our visual talent, but for how we listened. For how we told stories without stripping away soul. And everywhere we planted a flag, we made space for local talent, training and hiring from within the communities we served. The girl left on the curb had become someone others now relied on for their own beginnings. I never bragged. I never shouted into the void, demanding my family look at what I'd become. I didn't need to. The echo of their absence had already been filled with something far louder, my joy. My fulfillment. My thriving. That's why, when another certified letter arrived in late January, this one regarding the final dissolution of the Reynolds estate, I didn't flinch. The letter confirmed the sale of all remaining assets, including the business name, licensing rights, and family holdings. Enclosed was a final statement. It showed the distribution of funds and a note confirming that my portion, equal in every way to my brother's, had been deposited into the trust I'd established after receiving the original inheritance. There was no extra message. No apology tucked in the envelope. Just documents and decimals and a transaction that once would have held meaning but now felt irrelevant. Sam found me standing in the kitchen, holding the papers loosely. "Is it what you expected?" he asked. I shook my head. "It's just numbers." He nodded and went back to prepping dinner, understanding that the real wealth I valued couldn't be tallied in a statement. A few days later, Amber dropped by the studio. With her son, who was now 11 and full of questions about fonts, branding colors, and interface design. I handed him a sketchbook and said, "Draw your future. It's okay if it doesn't make sense yet." He beamed like I'd handed him the keys to something sacred. That same afternoon, Mason returned from a tech summit in Boise and surprised me with a plaque from a startup we'd helped launch the year prior. "They said we saved their dream," he said. I hung it on the wall beneath the words, "Purpose is louder than origin." That night, I stood outside on our back porch, wrapped in a wool shawl, and looked up at the same stars I'd once wished under as a child. Back then, I used to beg the universe to make my parents proud, to change me into someone more lovable, more acceptable, more tolerable. But under that same constellation now, I whispered something very different. "Thank you for walking away. Thank you for teaching me what home is not." Because if they hadn't driven off that day, if they hadn't severed the illusion, I might never have found the life that waited on the other side. I might have spent my entire adulthood trying to win over people who only knew how to withhold affection as leverage. Inside, Sam handed me a cup of cinnamon tea. We sat on the sofa, legs tucked under us, and watched a documentary about architecture in small-town America. He reached over and squeezed my hand during a scene about restoration, about how sometimes the only way to bring life back into something broken is to start fresh with pieces that still hold value. I thought of my past like that, scattered bricks from a structure that had never truly sheltered me. But now those fragments had been reassembled into something stronger, warmer, real. And I'd built it all without seeking their blueprint. Without asking for permission. Spring returned to Pinery Ridge slowly that year, painting the streets with wildflowers and breathing new life into the corners of town that had been dusted with winters quiet for months. As the snow melted and the sidewalks filled with neighbors hauling planters and fixing porch lights, I found myself standing inside a high school auditorium, waiting to speak to a group of seniors about resilience, design, and carving out paths when none seemed to exist. It had started as a one-time request. Eleanor had suggested me to the school counselor, but within weeks, it had become something more structured. They asked if I would mentor students interested in the creative arts. I said yes without hesitation. Each Friday afternoon, I sat with teenagers who reminded me of the girl I used to be, eager, full of ambition but not yet language, shaped by families that either didn't listen or didn't understand. One girl stayed behind after a session and asked, "What do you do when your own house feels like a war zone?" I looked her in the eyes and said, "You start building a new one. Even if it's just inside your mind, even if no one helps at first." She cried. I hugged her. And as I did, I realized I wasn't just living a different story, I was helping others rewrite theirs. That summer, Sam and I celebrated 5 years together with a small party in our backyard. Amber brought cupcakes shaped like mountains. Mason grilled. Eleanor danced barefoot on the patio with a glass of lemonade. It was the kind of joy that arrives not with noise, but with depth, solid, earned, and made from the kind of love that never demands anything back. As night fell and string lights twinkled above us, Sam raised a toast. "To Hazel," he said, "who took abandonment and built an empire. Not just of business, but of compassion." I didn't know what to say. The only thing that came out was, "I'm finally whole." And I meant every syllable. But just as peace felt stitched into every hour of my day, the past stirred again, this time not in a letter or a call, but in a rumor. Someone from town mentioned that Barbara Reynolds had been interviewed on a podcast back in Chicago. Apparently, she spoke vaguely about family estrangement, mistakes made, and hopes of reconnection. I didn't listen. I didn't need to. Because no version of that narrative could contain the full weight of what had happened, and no version she told could ever undo the version I had lived. Later that week, Sam found me sitting on the porch. Again, a sketch pad in my lap, but no lines drawn. He sat beside me and waited. I turned toward him and asked, "Do you think closure always has to come from the person who hurt you?" He thought for a moment before answering. "I think closure comes the day you stop needing anything from them." That's when I realized something had shifted permanently. For years, I thought healing would come wrapped in apologies, admissions, maybe even justice. But the real turning point had arrived long before, when I'd chosen my own silence, when I'd stepped back instead of chasing reconciliation, when I'd stopped hoping for something they'd never offer. And that realization didn't come like lightning. It came like sunrise, slow, certain, inevitable. Months later, I received an unexpected email from a literary agent who had read the Business West article and wanted to know if I had ever considered writing a memoir. I hadn't. But the idea of sharing my journey, not just the fall, but the rebuild, felt timely. After sitting with it for several weeks, I agreed. Not because I needed the world to understand my pain, but because I wanted others standing in gas station parking lots of their own to know they weren't alone. That their worth wasn't measured by who left them, but by how they got up after being dropped. I began writing in the evenings, a chapter at a time, each word an offering to the girl I used to be. Hazel, abandoned but unbroken. Hazel, forgotten, but forging. Hazel, silenced but never erased. I poured everything into that manuscript, every scar, every triumph, every hard-earned boundary. By the time the first draft was done, the agency had grown to a team of 16 across 4 states. We had secured a national contract with a travel brand and were shortlisted for a national award in community-driven branding. My story wasn't rare. That's what I discovered during those months of writing. But what made it different was the way I decided to carry it, not as shame, but as fuel. Not as burden, but as blueprint. I hadn't just survived what my family did to me. I had dismantled the pedestal they believed themselves to stand on and replaced it with a foundation they couldn't access. One I built with intention, stone by stone, love by love, hour by hour, in a town they still couldn't find on a map. 16 years after I was left behind on a dusty roadside in Wyoming, I stood in the headquarters of the very design studio I built from the ground up, watching a team of creatives, writers, developers, illustrators, strategists, collaborate beneath a mural that read, "Begin where they thought you'd end." We now occupied an entire historic building in the heart of Pine Ridge, every brick and beam echoing a story that began with heartbreak and ended with self-made peace. Clients flew in from major cities. We launched mentorship initiatives, built design pipelines for underfunded schools, and were featured in national publications that once felt unreachable. Yet none of those accolades came close to the feeling of watching someone walk into our space for the first time and realize they'd finally been seen. That was the real reward, not the praise, not the panels or interviews or contracts, but the quiet, consistent validation of a life built on integrity after surviving a family who once confused cruelty for closeness. On the 16th anniversary of the day they abandoned me, I received a small box in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single object, a photograph. It was the same picture they had sent me years ago from that vacation, the one where they sat smiling in the car as I stood unknowingly inside the gas station, snacks in hand, innocence still intact. This time, the caption scribbled across the bottom read, "We didn't know what we lost." I stared at it for a while. Not in anger, not in pain, but in astonishment that they still thought it was about what they had lost. It wasn't. This wasn't their tragedy. It had never been. It was mine. And then it became my triumph. I didn't frame the photo. I didn't tear it up. I didn't respond. I simply slid it into a drawer with other memories I no longer visited and locked it shut. Outside, my twin daughters were chasing butterflies in the garden while Sam clipped rosemary from the planter we built together. Our home, warm, sunlit, overflowing with joy, didn't carry echoes of the household I'd come from. We created a different language here. One rooted in listening, patience, gentleness. My daughters would never know what it was to be mocked by the people they loved most. They would never question whether love came with expiration dates or silent conditions. As they laughed beneath the wide Wyoming sky, I walked back inside, pulled out the manuscript of my memoir, and added one final sentence: "The girl they left behind never came home." Because the woman she became didn't need to. Weeks later, the memoir was accepted by a publisher. Advance copies were sent to bookstores nationwide. Miranda, the woman who ran the gas station that day, cried when I gave her the first signed edition. Eleanor, who had taken in a lost stranger and called her daughter without ever using the word, was honored in the acknowledgments. Amber's son wrote a school paper about "the bravest person he knows," and his teacher emailed us both with praise. Mason, now co-founder of New Horizon, designed the book's cover, a phoenix sketched in negative space, rising from a flat, cracked landscape. Sam said it was perfect. I agreed, and yet, in the quietest hours, just before dawn, when the world hasn't quite woken, I sometimes think about that moment at the gas station. The heat. The stillness. The realization that I had been left not by mistake, but by design. What they intended as humiliation became my genesis. What they meant as a lesson in obedience became a path to liberation. What they tried to destroy became the very thing that gave me shape. I wasn't molded by their approval. I was forged by their absence. That is how my story ends, not with revenge, not with reunion, not with redemption granted by those who hurt me, but with a life so full, so honest, so entirely my own that there is no space left for their version of events. I no longer carry their silence. I've replaced it with voices that cheer for me, students who learn from me, a family that nurtures me. I no longer wonder whether they regret what they did. Their regret is theirs to hold. My freedom is mine. So if you're watching this, and you've ever been discarded, dismissed, or told that your pain was a punchline, remember this: you are not defined by who failed to love you. You are defined by what you choose to become when no one is watching. And sometimes, being left behind isn't your ending. It's your beginning.